The 40-Year-Old Virgin is a 2005 American film directed by Judd Apatow and stars Steve Carell, Paul Rudd, Seth Rogen, Catherine Keener, and Romany Malco. The plot follows Andy, a lonely nerd whose life changes when he agrees to join his coworkers for a poker game. And I think that's a good enough introduction here, because I think you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who hasn't seen this. I mean, it's generally considered a classic comedy, by many, especially of its time. And I've always considered the early to mid-2000s to be kind of the last true era of comedy films. And I have a bit of a soft spot for it as well. And it's not that comedy stopped being made, over the last 15 years or so, but they have been few and far between, and I'm sure you've noticed, as to where it used to be one of the top genres, consistently. And I have a theory as to why I think that is that might hold some water, but I'll probably get into that someday. Now, like with all movies, but some more than others, the release year is pretty relevant in my opinion. Here it's quite important because back in 2005, things were just different here in the States, Comedy films were king, and they had been really for decades. In the late 90s, a promising up-and-coming writer moved into writing and directing, and love his work or hate it, he became an absolute force in the comedy world. And Judd Apatow, kind of started to hone his chops by directing some TV episodes of like Freaks and Geeks and the Larry Sanders Show. He decided to team up with an also up-and-coming Steve Carell, and together they wrote The 40-Year-Old Virgin. Now, I'm just going to say it right now. I don't think I would call myself necessarily a massive Judd Apatow fan, but, I am a fan of his writing style, and not so much the humor aspect, but everything else, really. Because, first of all, the man is very character-focused, which I like. And generally, all of his characters, for the most part, all have their own look, personality, and whether they are written particularly well, the effort is made, and I always appreciate it. I mean, I feel like he took the concept of your run-of-the-mill typical comedy style and he elevated it a little bit, and maybe that was something we needed at the time, just by being a solid writer and having a knack for storytelling, that average people can relate to. And I know it might sound weird, but I've always called his movies epic comedies. I've used that term many times. And I say that because even in a comedy world, he focuses on, as I said, not only characters and storytelling, but like his own style of world building. I mean, he just seemed to take that 90-minute comedy format and just bump it up to anywhere, from an hour and 45 minutes to like 2.5 hours. His movies typically are, while still keeping the pacing fairly sharp. And you might not think that world building is a thing in a place like Southern California, but it totally is. I have nostalgia for not only this movie, but for 2005. The shopping centers, the coffee shops, I love all that shit, Simpler times, I guess. The bulk of the main characters actually all work together at a retail store called Smart Tech. So just think Best Buy, and that's pretty much it. Steve Carell, Paul Rudd, Seth Rogen, and Romany Malco all work there, but there's also a handful of other like side characters that you meet there as well. And the Smart Tech store is pretty important to the story. Paul Rudd is a sweet, average type dude that is still trying to get over his ex-girlfriend. Seth Rogen is an edgy stoner. Romany Malco, the secret weapon here, in my opinion, is a smooth fuckboy with a big heart trying to change his ways. And of course, our lead, Steve Carell, who is, he's the focal point of almost everything that happens in this movie. And he does it with that Steve Carell class, even in a movie as over the top and as wild as this. And this was the movie that really made him a star. But don't get me wrong, he does his own heavy lifting here and showed the world that he was about to become a true force, and not just in the comedy world. It pushed Paul Rudd, further forward as well. Same with Seth Rogen. And according to Catherine Keener, a large portion of the dialogue was improvised. And that's another thing about Judd Apatow. He picks talented actors, that can be funny and give an actual, emotional performance when they need to. I also like how he puts a lot of his heart in his films. They just feel, for better or for worse, flaws and all, they feel human to me. And that's important. And his style early on, at least, was all about the main character struggling with something, learn some valuable lessons, and then ending on a happy note. And as much as I love, bleak, miserable movies, and I do, I also like to occasionally feel happy. Now, as with all comedies, I was curious to see how this has aged, because I hadn't watched this in a while. And I say that because I truly believe that the comedy needs to push boundaries. It is an art form after all. But as history always teaches us, sometimes we are wrong about things. And there is a scene or two here that didn't age particularly well. Most of the humor in The 40-Year-Old Virgin is crude, but I wouldn't say it's like mean-spirited, you know what I mean? So overall, as a film, I'd say it's aged pretty well, really, especially compared to some others. I mean, come on. And mainly due, in my opinion, to Judd Apatow's, everyman writing style and relatable characters. Something that I think at the time was a void that needed to be filled. My only real complaint here would be that some of the jokes kind of suffer from what I call Seth MacFarlane syndrome, where the bit just drags on for far too long, where some restraint would have actually made it better. The 40-Year-Old Virgin takes the age-old story of a dude just trying to get laid and turns it into, something a bit more, which sums up Judd Apatow's, writing style, at least in my opinion. So I'm giving The 40-Year-Old Virgin an 8.5 out of 10. This movie built careers, man, and it led to Judd Apatow building basically a comedy empire, and this is my favorite of his films. Anyways, guys, what's your favorite Judd Apatow film? If you have one, let me know. Cheers, guys, and I'll see you at the multiplex.